All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Jim, and I'm here to talk to you about APEC CBPRs here at CFP. That's an awful lot of acronyms in one sentence. So, first things first, we're going to break apart these acronyms so you can understand what the heck's going on. APEC is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, and CBPRs are cross-border privacy rules. Now, having explained the acronyms, you probably still don't understand what the heck any of that means either. So I'm going to explain that. All right. What is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, or APEC? It's a group of 21 nations, all bordering the Pacific Ocean. It is not a treaty organization for the law folks out there, which means that resolutions or initiatives passed through APEC do not have the force of law in any of the member countries. It just means it's a way for the countries to coordinate their future endeavors, and then they have to go back to their respective home countries and pass any necessary laws in order to enact the cooperation that's intended. CBPRs, cross-border privacy rules. They've been under construction, I would say, for the past 6 to 7 years with APEC, and right now they're just starting to launch, and they are a system of privacy protections and data transfer obligations that can be taken on voluntarily by corporations within the member nations who sign up to the program. And it's a way to voluntarily set a floor on your privacy obligations so that you're at least meeting a minimum level that's been found to be acceptable by all the countries. Now, this is not meant to be on par with the EU data privacy regulations. This is meant to be a way for these 21 nations to cooperate and understand each other's obligations when it comes to privacy. And you can see by the member nations that were listed here, we can't really expect all these member nations to be on board with an EU-type scheme. So this is a different way for the nations to regulate privacy. It's kind of an interesting way. It's a public-private partnership. There are several steps. Once you're one of the nations listed here, if you decide this is a great idea to join CBPRs, if you want to set a floor for your data collectors, and that's important to know, this is right now only for data collectors, not for data processors. The data processor rules are being worked on and will hopefully be out in the next couple of years, although they do move slowly. I've been to a couple of the meetings. They move slowly. So there's the steps to join in the CBPR system. First, a member economy has to declare their intent and file some paperwork with the APEC organization. Then there has to be an appropriate regulatory authority in place. This is not a data protection authority. As mentioned, many of these nations, including the US, does not have a data protection authority. But they need to have a regulatory authority who can enforce the CBPRs. In the US, that's the FTC. The FTC is not a data protection authority. They might wish to be one day, but they're not really yet. But they can enforce things like voluntary codes of conduct. And then there has to be an accountability agent. And this is where it's a public and private partnership. The accountability agent does not have to be a government agency, and I think is intended not to be a government agency. This is a private company. It could be a nonprofit. In the US, it's actually a for-profit company that is the one who really administers the day-to-day operations of the cross-border privacy rules with the backup of the government regulatory authority. If something really goes wrong, the government authority can come in and say, okay, we're going to find somebody or put a stop to them violating the rules. So here's a map. Unfortunately, the color is a little bit washed out on top, but that's okay. Here's a map, first of all, showing all the APEC nations. And it's kind of, you can see the impact of this group of nations getting together. And the blue are just APEC nations who have not yet chosen to join the CBPRs but could in the future. The green are nations that have fully joined the system. And I'll save you squinting. The US is the only one that's green on the map right now. The US has an appropriate regulator in place, the FTC. They've signed up to join the system. And their accountability agent is Trustee, which is a for-profit company out of San Francisco that I worked at until a couple months ago. And then there's countries in orange, which are in some state of actively working toward being members of the CBPR system. I'll start with Mexico. Mexico is actually the second nation to apply for CBPR status. They submitted their paperwork a while ago, a couple years ago, and then they did have a regulator in place, which was EFI, and then that regulator is kind of no longer in place in Mexico. There's a lot of politics that were happening. There's allegations of corruption, there was ministers being replaced, et cetera, et cetera. So there is some question still, because I have not kept up on my Mexico politics, as to who the regulator for personal data privacy is going to be in Mexico. And said that, there's also not an accountability agent who's readily available to step in there. So Mexico is a big question mark. After them is Japan. Japan submitted their paperwork. They have a government agency in place, and they have an accountability agent in JIPDIC who has stepped up. And I expect their paperwork to be completed probably in the end of this year, would not surprise me, or very early next year. So Japan is going to join the scheme. And then Canada has announced their intent to file their paperwork this year. And Canada has actually been the chair of the CBPR, the committee that runs CBPRs for APEC for the past several years. So I expect Canada, because they have that experience, they've reviewed the other nations' CBPRs, they've been the chair, that they're going to be fairly quickly through that process. And they're going to issue an open call for accountability agents in their equivalent of their Federal Register once their paperwork is submitted to APEC. And I don't know who is going to apply to be their accountability agent, but there's going to be an open call. They have not picked a winner, I guess, I'll put it that way. So right now there's only 5 companies that have been approved under the US, but I think this is a really interesting alternative to the government mandated approach taken in the EU. It's an interesting way to, now that they've created the framework through APEC, it's fairly extensible where each nation can move at their own pace and have companies be certified to transfer data around the Pacific to other nations. And it's not self-regulation, it's self-regulation plus, where we have the public-private partnership. All the data protection authorities and their equivalents from the 21 nations have worked on CBPRs, so they're all very aware of what CBPRs are. So it is a benefit to business, and I think it's an intriguing model for everyone to keep their eye on. If we have folks in the audience from the advocacy community, APEC has been open to having advocates there in their meetings and speaking their minds. It was quite interesting. The first meeting I went to, there was advocates in the meeting basically openly saying that the APEC process was ridiculous and a bad idea in the APEC meeting. But they welcomed that. They said, thank you very much for your viewpoints. We don't agree with you, obviously, that we're not idiots, but but they're very open. And I think, it's at the early stages of the proceedings. So I think this is something where advocates can still have a big impact. And I encourage you all in the audience to learn more about CBPRs. They do have the website up where you can read about the rules themselves that follow the Fair Information Privacy Principles. OECD guidelines were the basis for the rules. But you can read the particulars there. And I encourage everyone to learn more. It could end up having a big impact. It could end up being flash in the pan. We don't know yet, but I think it's an interesting thing to follow. Thank you.